Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Faruk Rahmanovich and I am joined again by brother Kareem.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
So in this series we're doing a chapter by chapter exploration of Sayyid Hussein Nasr's book A Young Muslim's Guide to the West, and we'll be focusing on one portion of a chapter in these sessions and delving more deeply into ideas within the passage, like what implications can you draw, conclusions you can come to, and showing you how to read these kinds of complex texts more closely. In today's session, we'll be looking at Chapter 4, Islamic Spirituality and Thought.
Now, before we get into a particular section of this chapter contains quite a few difficult terms. So, how about you get us started, Dr. Farooq, on some of these terms, what they mean, and what we should take away from them.
Alright, so there are three that I really want to touch on. There's a bunch of others that are actually names of groups or ideologies, and like for that you'll just have to Google them, really. That's the best bet. Otherwise we're going to be here all day, because in this chapter Sayyid Hussein Nasr covers a very broad variety of thinkers and ideologies within the Muslim world. But three that stand out that you really ought to know are peripatetic philosophy. Now, what we mean by the term peripatetic means Aristotelian in nature, or drawing off of the philosophy of Aristotle. Now, Aristotle is important here, and we'll touch on this a bit more later, but Aristotle develops this very neat way of doing logic, and he has some ideas that translate rather well into monotheistic religions, including his notion of the unmoved mover and perfection of the universe, and so on and so forth. So, unsurprisingly, a lot of Islamic thinkers would actually read Aristotle and then they would kind of riff off of him in an appropriately Islamic way in order to develop new ideas that are in line with Orthodox Islam. Our second term is Neoplatonism, and there is a whole bunch of development of thought here from Plato onwards and development of that, but we don't really care about that. The ultimate sort of idea behind Neoplatonism is the idea of understanding everything from a perspective of a single initial cause, or from a single initial source. Again, you can kind of see how this matches up with monotheistic religions. So you will also find that Christianity was big into Neoplatonism for a hot minute, and then that kind of broke down for their own political reasons. But the idea of trying to understand the whole world from the perspective of one initial source is ultimately the way that Muslims look at the world, because the initial source is God, and then everything else sort of relates back to that. So everything is interconnected, and then if you were to sort of reverse time, you would go back to your point of creation, the point of origin, which is the will of God. The final term is theosophy. And theosophy is any of the myriad of philosophical strains of thought where knowledge of God may be achieved by things like spiritual ecstasy, or direct intuition, or special individual relation with God. In essence, it's a sort of an esoteric path to God, which can be mediated by revelation. So it's one thing that there is revelation, but how you connect individually to that revelation and where it sort of takes you mentally, and how that allows you to individually connect to the idea of what God is and who you are and how those things are related, that can vary sort of person to person. Even if the orthodoxy of that revelation stays the same, right? Just the way that you as you connect and the way that I as I connect is a little different. And so that's sort of the way of thinking about these things. And so those are the three terms. All three of them are rather obviously heavily philosophical in nature. And Sayyid Hussein Nasr is sort of making the assumption that either you are aware of what these terms are, or you will go look it up yourself One would hope that it's ultimately both. As you read this, when you run into terms like these, you should at least be dropping them into Google to get some sense of what's going on.
All right, let's turn to page 76. We're going to go to the first full paragraph. The Muslims did not have an external reason for translating works of foreign origin into Arabic. The reason was neither political, nor economic, nor military. Nor was there any external religious pressure upon them to translate such works. The reason came from within the structure of the Islamic religion itself, namely, the Islamic emphasis upon knowledge and the fact that Islam considered itself to be the last religion of humanity and heir to every earlier revelation and every form of knowledge which confirmed the principle of Tawheed, or divine unity. With these Islamic teachings before them, once the Muslims established the foundation of Islamic society, they turned their attention to the translation of foreign texts concerning various forms of learning. Most of the translations were made from Greek, but there are also translations from Syriac, Pahlavi, and Sanskrit, and in a few instances from Nabatean and Latin.
All right. It's a very neat summary of the reason why the Islamic world has that first golden age. This is all happening somewhere between 750 and roughly 900 by Western calendar. In 751 we learn about paper. There was I think I watched a lecture called something like that, the most important event you don't know about. And what had happened is China had been working on expanding westward, and through Mongolia and down into that sort of Central Asia, or we'll just call it the Central Asian region. And there they encountered the armies of, I want to say, the Abbasid Empire. I could be off. Whoever ruled in 751. And they suffered a sort of defeat that they didn't recover from in terms of further expansion westward, right? They suffered the defeat and they went like, nope, this expansion westward thing isn't for us, and they drew back into China. So that's one of the big consequences there. But the other one is two of the people who were captured in that battle as prisoners of war were part of a Chinese guild that had invented paper. Now, at the time, that paper was more like today's cardboard, but, whatever. The idea is that paper making was a secret. Now, as prisoners of war, they were given the options of being ransomed off, or, so if somebody could pay for them to get out, or they could sort of work off the kind of damage that they might have wrought. Right? So if you think of post-war reparations that we did in after World War I, which was not a hot idea. Instead of making an entire nation pay for it, the standard at the time of Islamic militaries was that prisoners of war are held sort of individually responsible for their little contribution to the damage wrought, and they can either have somebody pay for them so that they can get out, right? So now the damage has been paid off. Or if they have nobody who's willing to pay for them, then they can work it off over a couple of years, and ta-da, there you go. Well, these two guys that knew paper making traded the knowledge of paper making for their freedom. And the rest of the world finally got paper making as a thing. And so the Islamic Empire at the time brought it back, and one of the key parts of this development is that the state would buy the inventions and developments and translations and then make them freely available to everybody. And so within something like 10 years of getting a hold of paper, there was like 50 paper mills around Baghdad, and paper had moved from being cardboard to starting to resemble today's paper kind of thing, and then that allowed for translations to sort of take off and for new works to be written, because finally you have something that'll sort of hold shape rather than like you got to go skin an animal to write down your thoughts. And if they're bad thoughts, right? If they don't like make sense, then ta-da, congratulations on. I mean, I guess you got a meal out of it, but that's sort of the issue that got um, resolved. So the point here is something like the Muslim world invested incredibly heavily into research and development. And I think this paragraph does a really good job of sort of giving you the general overview of the historical background of why they bother doing that. Because it's not readily apparent that any civilization would or should do such a thing, right? It's a lot of money, it's a lot of effort for something that doesn't seem to sort of have an immediate material benefit.
Sure. And the paragraph actually starts off with a negation there in the first few sentences, right? The Muslims did not have an external reason for translating works of foreign origin into Arabic. And then, in case you're not really sure what he means by external reason, the next sentence says the reason was neither political nor economic nor military, nor was there any external religious pressure to do this. So even before he says outright where the reason comes from, it's already implied that it's internal. Right? Now, when he talks about things like political, economic, or military pressure, what do you think he's trying to get at there?
So we have certain kinds of social developments that we try to actualize as societies as a result of some sort of a crisis that we run into. So development of weapons that we use are usually based off of what our enemies have. Right? So when Germans in World War I came up with their version of tanks that seemed to be just blowing everybody else up, then everybody else had to go like, oh, we're going to lose if we don't come up with a better design, right? So that's external pressure that's going to modify where you invest resources of a society, right? You might have a problem with the way that a monarchy is running your government, and it looks like you're on the verge of civil war kind of thing, and now there's an external pressure, right, like you are about to get crushed under your own weight, unless you can come up with some sort of an alternative to what's obviously not working, right? So these are external pressures forcing you to adapt or die, right? You can almost think of them in evolutionary terms, right? Is your environment forcing you to adapt or get crushed? And Sayyid Hussein Nasr's answer here is no. There was no such pressure as the driving force for these things like translations of foreign texts into Arabic. And Arabic, by the way, just because it was the most widely spoken language of the Islamic sort of empires, because your ruling class was almost inevitably Arab, at least partially. And on top of that, if you wanted to understand the Quran, which they thought was an absolutely necessary portion of this, you better speak Arabic. So since everybody spoke it, this way you could translate a text that only a few people can read because it's a very foreign language. You can translate it into a sort of universal medium for your country, and then everybody can read it. So the way that we translate stuff into English here, even though we have a bunch of different dialects of English, and there's Creole and Pidgin and Ebonics and all the rest of that, you translate everything into English because everybody seems to have access to that, and then we all get it.
Great. Yeah, when you were saying this, I was thinking about how everything that a person does, or a society does, really should have a principle underlying it, right? We don't act randomly, or at least we shouldn't. And if you're acting randomly, the outcome's probably going to be really bad. You're going to end up with societal contradictions. The principle underlying acting when you have an external pressure would be survival. However, what he's pointing out here is that this is not what the Muslims at this time period were doing. They weren't thinking, hey, we need to do this, we need to know this stuff in order for us to survive. So instead we have to look internally for what is the internal principle behind why the early Muslims were, putting all of this time and energy into translating these works. Let's take a look at the next sentence. The reason came from within the structure of the Islamic religion itself, namely the Islamic emphasis upon knowledge and the fact that Islam considered itself to be the last religion of humanity and heir to every earlier revelation and every form of knowledge which confirmed the principle of Tawheed, or divine unity. So here we have his position on why the early Muslims actually did this. We have the idea that it comes from the structure of the Islamic religion itself. We have a couple of principles here, right? The idea that there is a focus in Islam upon gaining knowledge, and that Islam considers itself to be the last religion of humanity and the heir to every earlier revelation.
So, this idea of emphasis upon knowledge and the idea of being the last religion. So, you have to understand this in several ways at once, and this is really what philosophers do. This is the way we think, this is the way we write, and Sayyid Hussein Nasr is a really, really good philosopher. So what we do is, like in chapter 1, he hands you a ball. He goes like, here, hold this. And you're like, okay. In chapter 2, he hands you another one. Like, hold this too. And you're like, okay. By the time you get to chapter 4, you have like, a good dozen balls that you're holding, and he goes like, now juggle all of them simultaneously, right? Like, you have to be able to deal with all these concepts at once in order to like really start extracting meaning. So in, I want to say, chapter 1, he talks about the idea of revelation as a source of knowledge, right? In fact, of God as the source of knowledge, and then revelation is a way that God communicates with us. So what is being transferred through the revelation is the knowledge of God to humanity, right? So that's that sort of second part there, right? We are the last religion. That's the sales pitch. Now, if we are the last religion, it means that there is going to be no further sharing of knowledge from on high. This is all you get, right? The spigot has been closed from top down. And what you're left with now could be just like, well, this is true and nothing else is, and that's sort of the end of it. And these are exactly the kinds of ways of thinking that Al-Ghazali labels as utterly ignorant beyond belief. Because rather obviously, other peoples, other civilizations, even other religious groups have hit upon some kind of knowledge that is actually true, whether they got it through their revelation, if they happen to be Ahl al-Kitab, or whether they just sort of, like, somebody worked it out, right? Doesn't matter. The other thing that happens in chapter 1 is Sayyid Hussein Nasr points out that nature itself, the world itself, reality, is part of revelation, right? So you find that the Quran is composed of ayat, and ayah literally means a sign, like no left turn kind of sign, right? It's an indicator pointing to something. And so we don't have just one source of revelation, right? We have one source of sort of top-down, that's Allah revealing through revelation truth to us. But the world itself is a kind of revelation, right? It is filled with signs. And the question is, are you smart enough to look at those signs and figure out where you're going? Maybe a bad analogy, but sort of top-down guidance is your GPS knowing you where to go, right? This sort of looking at the world guidance is, are you able to look at the road signs and figure out where to go? Mm-hmm. Ultimately, your destination is the same, but it's a question of, are you able to do both things? So the Islamic emphasis on knowledge comes from two things. One is this idea through revelation, right? So it's top-down knowledge. And also, by the way, one of the core names for Allah is Al-Haq, right? The truth. And we can get to that maybe in the next lecture, because that term also doubles in meaning for justice. I think it's rather interesting that truth and justice are the exact same word contextually. But so Allah is the truth, and He gives us the truth, but then the world itself is also the truth, and we as Muslims are supposed to submit to the truth. And so the idea of going out and getting all the knowledge we can is considered itself to be a religious act, if done for the correct intentions, like everything else.
Sure, you could say it becomes a responsibility.
Yes.
Right? If we're the last religion, then we have a responsibility to learn about what came before us.
And not just in that religious sense, but also in all the ways in which everything has happened and the ways in which everything works, because ultimately reality is also part of the truth, right? What has been made real, and understanding those things allows you to understand, if you will, the will of God, right? Because that reality represents something that God willed into existence. And so being able to understand those things and the way that they interconnect and they interlock and how they work, all of that is further signs that you are studying. In fact, I think it's one of Al-Ghazali's commonly quoted lines. He doesn't come up with it, he's quoting somebody else too, and I think he might be, I don't think he's talking about it as a hadith, I think he's just attributing it to somebody like Ali ibn Abi Talib. An hour spent in contemplation is better than a night spent in prayer, right? Because reflecting on the truth, it's not just ritualistic. It forces you to be engaged with it, as opposed to, like, you could do you could pray without really paying attention, right? I'm sure everybody's done it at Tarawih at some point, right? We just sort of like zone out and you're mechanically going up and down, right? But you can't mechanically be deep in thought, right? So it's that sort of comparison there. I don't know whether that sort of fits, but I think it's close enough. So the Islamic emphasis on knowledge is you need to know everything, because all knowledge is ultimately positive. The idea of being a last religion means that there is no more top-down knowledge, so all the knowledge that's left available is now bottom-up. It's you observing the world, interacting with it, learning from it, and moving forward. The idea of being an heir to every earlier revelation is, again, actually something that Al-Ghazali talks about, but it's this idea that the source of the truth is irrelevant. If it's true, it's universally true, right? So, sake of argument, Hindus came up with the kind of numbers that we use these days. In the West we call them Arabic numerals, but that's just because the West names their things based on where they found them, not where they're actually from. That's why it's also called Damascus steel. And like then you go to the Arab world and you go like, what is this? And they go like, oh, that's Hindi steel, right? Same deal. We call them Arabic numerals, but like you go to the Arab world and you go like, what are these? And they go like, those are Hindi numerals, right? It's irrelevant that Hinduism or the adherents of Hinduism develop these ideas, or mathematical ideas, or metallurgical ideas, or whatever they are. If they are true, then they are true, period. Right? And anything that's true is inherently valuable. And so you take all the true things and you gather them all up, and you try to share them with as many people as you can. And that's how you sort of get that idea of the state buying information from people that they've developed so that you get rewarded for your work, and then disseminating it freely so that others may make use of it, right? And finally, the idea of, you have this, every form of knowledge would confirm the principle of al-Tawheed, or divine unity. Essentially what that boils down to is something like this: the only kinds of knowledge that Muslims did not take up was the kind that was inherently contradictory to Islam. So sciences of divination, of, you know, like telling the future kind of thing, those things were dropped because from an Islamic standpoint, one, that isn't a science, and then two, it directly contradicts the idea that Allah's will is supreme.
Right.
Right.
It's the difference between astrology and astronomy.
Yes.
Right. So astrology is, I'm going to look at the locations of the stars and the planets, and it's going to tell me the future. Or, when I was born tells me all about my personality.
Yes.
Right?
Oddly enough, to a certain extent, I think it's actually true, but not in the way that they sort of pitch it. If you were born at whatever, let's say in January or something like that, in a place where it's very cold, then your earliest memories and a whole bunch of other things, like at what exact age do you start school? How big are you compared to other kids? I think Freakonomics has a thing
Sure.
on hockey with this.
I was just about to bring that up. Yeah, in the book Freakonomics, the author notices a strange, what he thinks is a coincidence at the beginning, where all of the Canadian hockey players that he's watching, it's like at the junior national competition or something like that. It's like, these are the kids who are going to be going to become pros one day. The vast majority of them are all born in January, February, or March. And a very small percentage are born in the later part of the year. So you could just conclude from that, oh, well, people who are born in the first few months of the year must inherently be more athletic. But that would be far too simplistic and far too of a surface kind of analysis. He looks at the issue in more depth, and he discovers that in Canada, they determine their youth leagues on the basis of calendar year. So all the kids who are born in, say, 2012 are all going to be put in the 8-year-old one right now in 2020. So that's a kid who was born in January of 2012, who is actually 8 years old right now, but it's also, and is almost 9 at this point, but it's also a kid who was born in December of 2012, who's still actually 7 years old and hasn't even turned 8 yet. So who do you think has the advantage in that situation? Well, the ones who are born at the beginning of the year are going to be bigger, and especially when you're young, being bigger is just going to translate into being more skilled, right? Just being older. And it has a cumulative effect over the years. The kids who are better end up getting on the better teams, like these traveling teams. They're the ones who get the more advanced coaching. And so, over the course of that year, they become a little better. Well, now they move to the 9-year-olds team, and they're even a little bit better now. And so once again, they end up making the all-star teams or these traveling teams, and once again, they get the best coaching, they become a little better. And this keeps on happening. Now he points out, for the ones who are really talented, or perhaps their parents are paying for them to have outside help as well, it doesn't matter. I mean, they could be born in November, it's just not going to make a difference. They're going to end up making it anyway. But on the balance of things, the ones who are born towards the beginning of the year have this incremental advantage that keeps building up a little bit more each year and each year. So by the time they get into high school, just on average, they're going to be better. It also shows why it's important not to just engage in a surface analysis of a subject. Your first instinct in that situation may be just to say, oh, there must be something about that particular time that makes them inherently better. And then you discover there's actually a more complex explanation behind it.
And you also don't want to be dismissive of things that don't sort of look right initially. You're like, well, if astrology isn't real, then that isn't really the case, and so it's not going to be the case that kids born in January, February, and March are, let's say, overrepresented in highly successful hockey players. It is in fact true that they are overrepresented, but there's a reason that doesn't have anything to do with astrology, which is sort of like, yeah, it's the other version of surface level analysis that just sort of dismisses that as not being possible.
Sure.
Right? Like, oh, don't bother looking at the data. You just go like, well, there isn't going to be a magical difference, and then whoops, you're
Sure.
wrong. Either way, just for different reasons.
Right, and just to point out really quickly, this exists not just in Canada, but you can see it in America too, except that we typically draw the cutoff line more based on school years. And so instead, it's the kids who are born around the fall. They're the ones who tend to be older than the kids who are born in the spring. For that particular cohort, that school year, they're the ones who tend to have the advantage. And so, it actually becomes inevitable right? That some of them are going to have an advantage over others, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it in that regard.
So,
But just one more thing, I think we can see this on a broader scale, though. We talk about generations, right? Baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and such like that. That's another way that you can say, well, this particular time that I was born has an effect on me, right? If you were born and lived in, say, 1946, and lived the first 40 to 50 years of your life before there was, mass production of computers, it's going to be harder for you to get used to using a computer. On the other hand, we've got kids who, the ones who were born in the last, 10, 15 years or so. I mean, it's just second nature at this point. They're the ones teaching the 70-year-olds how to do things on the computer.
No, Grandpa, that's not how you use Zoom.
Right. So, try to look for it not just being some sort of a really simple explanation like that, and try to look to see other circumstances too, right? Like I said, Canada and hockey, it's like if someone wanted to analyze that critically, they would say, all right, is it just true of hockey? What about other sports? Is it just true about Canada? What about other places? Perhaps when you get multiple pieces of information, you can do a better job of putting it all together and get a better picture of what's actually happening here. In statistical analysis, like especially in the social sciences, that's a big danger that a lot of people fall into, is trying to explain a particular phenomenon, like a human phenomenon, like why people do a certain thing, trying to explain that through just one variable. This is the entire explanation behind it. So, the election. Well, it's the economy, stupid. That was Clinton's slogan back in 1992. And while there's a lot of truth to that economic matters tend to be heavily influential on a lot of people's votes, it would be silly to just declare that, well, if the economy's going well, the president's going to be reelected. And if the economy's going poorly, the president is going to lose. Because people are more complex than that, and there's oftentimes a lot of factors that go into why we do what we do.
Yeah, so really, you don't work off of a single data point, and I think that this was part
or
of
a single variable.
Yes.
Right.
And then this is part of what we were, I think, talking about last week in part, the idea that you can't just sort of like cherry pick a line out of a text, because you ultimately suffer from the same problem, right? The thing you're looking at, you don't know whether this is an exception or the rule, or like what has gone into it, like how is it actually structured. Like you're just seeing like this one really narrow angle, and you literally can't possibly figure out rationally what it is that you're looking at, right? And thus, getting either multiple sources of data, like is this happening in other countries, or even just digging deeper into that like one source of data, right? So things like, okay, yeah, you're telling me that kids born in January are doing better. What do we know about kids born in January as they entered that year of whatever the hockey league is, right? What's their height, what's their weight, what's their shoe size, whatever, right? And so like as you dig deeper into the one piece of data and it sort of starts branching out, you can again start seeing patterns of like, oh, hold on a second, all these kids are like 3 inches taller, they're all carrying an extra like 30 pounds of mass, right? They all start off skating an additional like 4 miles an hour faster, right? Like, so it sort of falls out. But either way, it's sort of this indication that you have to do a ton of work yourself, and you can't just take somebody's concluding line and run with it. And just to tie this back into Sharia, I have actually here, I'll put it up as a visual. I have a book here. It's called The Fatwa on Terrorism and Suicide Bombings. And it is a book of 413 pages of full contextual analysis. the last paragraph is the conclusion. 413 pages, and one paragraph is the conclusion, right? So imagine if you skip reading the 413 and a half pages, and then you just read that last half a page, and you go like, I know what's going on. No, you don't. Same thing with U.S. Supreme Court decisions, right? Like we hear a yes or no on a ruling, but then you have the majority opinion and the minority dissent, and like it's this massive document in how they thought about it and why and what are the different elements, and just that surface level analysis is just ultimately garbage because you have no idea what it actually means. I think I was talking to you a while back on one of the abortion things that went before the Supreme Court, and they just sort of threw it away because their position was that this, the way that it's worded, opens up so many doors that nobody's trying to open that any ruling, yay or nay, on it would ultimately, cause problems. Even though the sort of main pitch of what the suit was something that they thought might be otherwise agreeable, right? So again, like not looking into the whole thing, you're just going to end up with god awful ideas about everything. So anywho,
all right, yeah, let's move back.
Yeah.
For a minute here, because when you were talking earlier, it made me think about something. For a modern Muslim, or maybe even a modern non-Muslim, who's grown up with a lot of modern ideas, they might be confused about some of what you had to say here. They might say something like, but wait a second, I thought that religion and science were supposed to be contradictory. I thought they were supposed to be in opposition to one another. And now here you are, and here is Dr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr coming along and telling me that no, back with the early Muslims, back in the early days, they didn't see it like that at all. And in fact, they considered it a religious obligation to be going out and getting knowledge. So how do you reconcile that?
So that idea that religious knowledge and let's call it worldly knowledge, right, that they are somehow opposed to one another, there's a name for it. It's called conflict thesis, and it's roughly from 1880s. And the idea is that religion and science are inversely proportional. So as one increases, the other one drops, and so on and so forth. And the way to think about this bad idea ultimately is something like this. The way that revelation is supposed to work is from the top down, from God to man. And the way that reason is supposed to work, worldly knowledge is supposed to work, is from the bottom up, right? So you look at the world and then you work your way up towards principles. And the way that the conflict thesis pitches this is something like these are two entirely separate sort of processes, and the religious side over here is going to be passing through a space that has nothing to do with science, and science is going to be building on a space that has nothing to do with religion, and so the two sort of don't really even meet, but that religious people deny the existence of science, and then that scientifically minded people deny the existence of God, right? That's sort of the sales pitch. And ultimately this position makes zero sense from any angle you actually want to look at it from. It has been debunked by scientists, by religious people, by scientists, by scientists, by scientists, by science, by historians of science, but it is a zombie claim. No matter how many times you kill it, it just keeps coming back, right? Not staying down. And it's because it's very easy to not actually think about what the implications would be. Right? if this idea was true, then the more religious the society, the less scientifically advanced they would be. And the less scientifically advanced they would have been, the less of their science would sort of be around on top of everything else. All the core sciences were developed in antiquity by ridiculously religious people. Right? Like, we don't have that level of religiosity these days, almost anywhere. And think about the Egyptians. The Egyptians thought of the pharaoh as an actual literal god. Right? It's that level of zealotry. And yet, their material sciences, like material tensions and like at what point materials break under pressure, things like that, their math, their physics, their geometry, all of those things, and their astronomy too, not astrology, but like the actual study of what's happening up in the heavens. Those things were so dead on that 4,500 years later, that pyramid is still standing there. Right? It's been through earthquakes galore. It's still standing. There are two 50-ton slabs of stone that are perfectly balanced against one another to hold up, literally hundreds of tons of other rock weight above it, and nothing has shifted over 4,500 years. I would say the Egyptians were incredibly scientifically advanced, right? But their paints that are like, you've seen those like murals inside the pyramid.
Sure.
The color on that is from 4,500 years ago, and it hasn't faded, and it hasn't chipped. And their metallurgy for those caskets and the paint on that metal and all of that has been around for. To give you an idea here, you are closer to Caesar and Cleopatra in time than Caesar and Cleopatra were to the pharaohs that built the pyramids. Roughly 2,000 years between you and Caesar, and another 2,500 years back. Right? I mean, these are people that lived in mud huts, and that is their scientific achievement. And they're certainly not the only ones. You can find the ziggurats in Iraq, so on and so forth. And then you get to the Islamic world, and you have this explosion of scientific development. Nobody thinks that this is somehow in tension with their religion. So one way to think about this, and as far as I can see, this is how all of these people and thinkers actually thought about it, is not as these fields that pass through separate spaces, but instead imagine the processes sort of intertwined, one going up, the other one coming down, passing through ultimately the same space, and they are complementing each other, right? So the idea of revelation gives you something like the purpose of the world, and it also tells you that you ought to go out and study the natural world itself, because it is some sort of a sign of purpose and higher power and telos and all the rest of that. And so that's informing you that way. And then science comes in and it does the study of these things and understands how complexly interwoven all these things are, which sort of feeds back into the idea of a single source that does all of this creation and all the rest of that. And so the sort of DNA option here is there on purpose to sort of give you an additional visual of sort of precisely what's meant. These weren't supposed to be separate things. These ideas, by the way, they come out of late Renaissance, early Enlightenment Europe. And this isn't a problem with the religious ideas and scientific ideas. This is a problem where a religious dogma adopted a philosophical concept in a dogmatic way and then was unable to let it go, right? Like when we talk about it, Galileo, nobody thought that Galileo was wrong because the Bible said so. They thought that Galileo was wrong because Aristotle said so. And I'll throw a link in the description so you guys can sort of see how that works. But the idea that like where religion is somehow in opposition to science is silly beyond belief. If it wasn't for religion, none of these societies would have invested the kind of crazy resources and manpower and time into developing ideas that have nothing to do with immediate material gain. And that's ultimately what they did. I mean, nobody's developing calculus, you know, because that will solve our food shortage, right? You're solving calculus because calculus, right? So it's a completely wrong-headed way of looking at things. And again, you can even just Wikipedia conflict thesis, and they will have a list of all the debunks that have happened since roughly 1880s, and there's a ton of them. So yeah, it's a bad piece of information that keeps getting passed on, and everybody keeps quoting, keeps citing Galileo as if that magically proves everything. Like the other 8 gajillion years of religion building up science somehow goes out the window because Galileo is a thing.
Sure. Yeah, I was trying to think about how this came about and why it still exists. And so, of course, Galileo and that story is an important part of it. It's clearly a Western problem. However, in the modern world, Western ideas, and by extension, Western problems, have found their way across the whole world now. But I thought of another reason for why this idea has survived for so long. And I think it's because people like to think in terms of narratives. They like to think in terms of stories. If you want to convince someone of something, build a narrative around it. And so the Galileo story is a prime example of that narrative, right? That religion and science are in conflict with each other. And unfortunately, if you want to confirm that narrative, if you want to engage in confirmation bias, it's not that hard to find examples, even today, of, I don't know, Westboro Baptist Church, or like one of these groups or something like that, or ISIS, who will confirm the narrative for you. And if you don't put in the time and the effort to find out that, hey, wait a second, not only are there all of these counter examples to that, but the underlying idea behind it doesn't really work. If you don't put that time and effort in, then you're going to keep believing it. So even though it's been debunked again and again, it like a roach, it keeps coming back.
Just die already.
This conversation also reminded me of something else. I don't want to get us too far off on a tangent, but it's funny that you mentioned the Wikipedia article for conflict thesis, because there's a quote in it that I think is really interesting for a related subject. Stephen Hawking, who you would argue is, or pretty much anyone would consider like one of the most intelligent people of the last 50 years, and I'm referring to just raw intelligence, like IQ score, is a supporter of the conflict thesis. He says outright, there's a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. Science will win because it works. We can get into why he's wrong, if you'd like to, but I wanted to point this out, to point out the idea that intelligence by itself is not good enough. It's not good enough to understand the world. We can't just assume that because someone is more intelligent that they've got everything figured out, and we ought to listen to them. Now, if someone is intelligent and also an expert in a particular area, perhaps it carries more weight to you then, what their ideas are. But just the idea that intelligence is equated to moral worth, right? That we should attribute more worth or more value to someone or to what someone says just because of their raw intelligence is unfortunately an idea that's become quite pervasive in our society, and it leads to all sorts of really serious problems. Because consider the opposite of that. Right? I believe it would be the converse or the inverse of that idea would be the idea that if you are less intelligent, then you must be inferior. You must not be worthy, right? And so, therefore, people start becoming squeamish or scared even of even discussing the concept of intelligence, right? Especially on the negative side. You can call someone smart, but calling someone dumb then becomes an absolutely horrible thing to do, right? Because if intelligence is equated to worth, then calling someone unintelligent is calling them lesser in value.
And I think this is part of sort of materialistic reading of the world, because the more intelligent you are, the greater the scope of issues that you can meaningfully contribute to. Like Elon Musk, right? That dude is just absolute genius level thinker. Like everything that dude touches turns to gold. Right? He goes into a field that he has no business being in because he knows nothing about it, and like a week later he's revolutionized it. Right? Now, from a materialistic utilitarian perspective, you look at somebody like Elon Musk and you go like, that dude he's contributing so disproportionately, he's punching so far above the weight of any one individual that it is scary, right? And he's only able to do that because intellect, right? He's able to think of problems in completely new ways, and therefore is able to create solutions in entirely new ways. And so he's obviously beneficial to society because of his contribution to society, right? Now, the reverse of that is going to be like, all right, start dropping the IQ and tell me when you have somebody who's now a burden on society. And at that point, that person is, from a utilitarian standpoint, from a purely materialistic standpoint, that person is literally less. Right? They end up being a net negative for existing. Because the way that we count positive and negative there is purely on your materialistic contribution to the society that you're in. So anybody who's disabled in any way ends up, by virtue of needing extra money, effort, time, etc. put into them, they end up being viewed materialistically as being somehow less worthy because they're sucking up so many more resources. I mean, take me for instance, just the 11 surgeries that I had here in the US, just the bed itself, no doctors, no nurses, no surgery, no anesthesia, no pills, nothing. Just the bed itself cost about $350,000. Now, think of all the things you could have done for $350,000. Now, all that went into one individual, and I got super lucky in this manner because my disability was something that you can fix and be done with. You don't have to keep pouring money into it. But certainly many of the other kids there at the Shriners Hospital had the kinds of disabilities that don't go away. Right? If you have spina bifida, that's the rest of your life. Right? So the kinds of resources we have to pour into you are very high. And if you only view those people materialistically, then they're a net negative on society. And so in fact you find these old societies that they used to kill people like that, right? Greeks used to throw babies with a cleft lip and palate, which is what I was born with, into a well, because they had no way of fixing that long term, and you'd probably starve by the time you were about 3. And so to them that was the most merciful thing they could do, right? It would make you suffer for 3 years or kill you now, right? That was their balance. Spartans were a little less merciful about this, right? It's like, oh, if you're not like beefcake baby, off the cliff you go. So it's important to sort of understand where that intelligence part comes in at, because really we're judging your potential contribution to society. And if the only kind of contribution you can make is a materialistic one, then you are, in fact, by that set of values, less.
And think about the consequences.
You don't have to read it that way. It's only the utilitarians who have this kind of an outlook. Islamically, for example, all human beings are morally equal. Now, we're going to be functionally different, right? Your skill set is going to be different than my skill set. So depending on the specific job that I have, you may be better than me, or I may be better than you. But that doesn't say anything about our moral worth. It just says, something like whichever one of us is taller is going to be better at getting things down off the top shelf. And if we're both as tall as Yao Ming, and I need somebody to fit into an AC duct, then Steve the Pygmy is the choice, while the two of us really suck at that job. Again, this is a functional reading, not a moral reading. Neither one of us is better than the other morally. Neither one of us is more human. Neither one of us has more rights. But if you need to solve this particular task, this is the kind of tool you need. So if your laptop is having problems, you would expect the person fixing it to start off with like a screwdriver or something like that. You would not expect them to get out a sledgehammer, right? Because functionally, the sledgehammer is worse at fixing laptops than your screwdriver is. Just sort of the state of reality there.
Sure. Yeah, and I was thinking about, like, imagine what the consequences of this are. Right? In fact, there's a really good example. About a year or two ago, there was a news article. Denmark has gotten rid of Down syndrome. Right? I mean, based on the title of the article, you'd think they found a way to cure Down syndrome,
Like,
which
woohoo!
would be outstanding. What was it actually? Just 100% abortion rate for babies who they were able to figure out in utero had Down syndrome. And Down syndrome is just the third chromosome of one of the sets. It's like trisomy 21 or something like that, right, out of the different sets there. That's all that it is, just one extra chromosome. In fact, my great-grandmother had originally a boy, although a man, eventually, who had Down syndrome, who she adopted as a foster child. He lived well into his 40s, and by all accounts, like anytime I saw him, he was a very happy person. Now, if you determined someone's worth on the basis of what they contributed materially to society, then he doesn't have any worth, because he doesn't contribute anything materially. But on the other hand, if you believe that human life has some sort of inherent value to it, then the idea of aborting a child simply on the grounds that he is going to have Down syndrome is repulsive. It's abhorrent. And so we see that the issue here has more to do with different worldviews, different ideas about what determines worth, different principles.
Yeah, I wanted to hop back to the idea of expertise and all that off of your initial Stephen Hawking position. This is one of the problems that we talked about when we covered the claim shredder. And the idea was something like relying on the supposed authority of others in a way that you outsource your own thinking is always a problem, right? So just because somebody is a supposed expert on an issue doesn't actually make them right. Mm-hmm. It might increase their odds of being right. It probably gives them a much wider contextual understanding of what's going on if they're actually bothering to think. But it doesn't mean that they're automatically right. You cannot just take their word for it. Right? So you always have to think critically for yourself. And if the other person isn't willing to provide you a sort of walkthrough of how it is that they came to this conclusion and show you what assumptions they're making, what data they're using, and all the rest of this, it just sort of comes across as an opinion. So if judges have to justify their rulings, then anybody else, to me, who makes a claim on anything has to justify how they got there. And in fact, I don't really care what a person's claim is. I really care about that justification, because it's very difficult to come to a garbage claim through good justification. and it's doesn't mean that if you have a good justification that you automatically end up with a true claim, but that's sort of a separate issue. So yeah, don't buy into the idea of like, oh well, Stephen Hawking said it. Yeah, so like I'm pretty sure that Newton was exceptionally intelligent, and we've thrown out the entirety of his physics. Right, like we kept nothing. The dude was dead wrong, and Einstein proved him wrong, and we're about to like throw out Einstein any day now because we can't make that work either. Right, we're finding holes in that theory too. So it's don't buy the hype, I guess, is a point. You got to do your own work either way. Alright, so we're just over an hour, so I will wrap this up right quick. The reason why I thought that this paragraph was really important is because of the way that Sayyid Hussein Nasr concludes the chapter, with this idea of the importance of knowing this history. Because if you don't know this history, then what happens is you have an understanding of Islam, or really ultimately of any other field. Right? Imagine if you only know the right now, in a very twisted way. Whatever the thing is that you're looking at, it's going to look like it's a completely backwards way of thinking. So if you only understand Islam as what was it in a Florida textbook, wailing and bowing to a box in the desert. Yeah, I kid you not, there was a lawsuit over that.
Wow.
Like if that's your understanding of Islam, then it's really not surprising that as a young person in a secular society, you're having a hard time with your Islam, because your understanding of the thing that you're supposed to be is incoherent to begin with. Like what was that line that Reverend Hall has talking to Richard Dawkins? He goes like, I don't believe in the God you don't believe in either. Right? Like if you misidentify, if you mischaracterize what Islam is, then of course you're going to have a hard time accepting it, right? If your entire knowledge of Islam is essentially what you get off of Fox News or what you hear Sam Harris say, then quite frankly, I wouldn't believe in that either. So it's really important to actually understand that there's this insanely important for everything history of theological studies, of philosophical studies, of scientific development, of political development, of all of these things. And it's important both for Muslims and non-Muslims, because either way, it at least gives you an understanding of how the world developed the way that it did. How is it that Europe is going to get these advancements down the line and be able to make use of them? Like, they didn't fall out of the sky. And it also tells you, like, as a Muslim, that you shouldn't go around and say, like, look at all the things that Muslims invented. Like, yes, Muslims invented plenty of things, but they were also able to tap into the knowledge of dozens of civilizations that they encountered, civilizations that had prospered and done very well. And we were able to sort of like suck up everybody else's knowledge, translate all of it into Arabic, so now it's all in the same language. Then we put it together in new and unique ways, and then on top of that we built up stuff, right? It wasn't just, being Muslim magically made you better at math or something. So that, by the way, is an indication that, again, as Sayyid Hussein Nasr points out, Muslims have historically and should continue to take knowledge from any source that they find it with, because knowledge is ultimately knowledge. And if it's true, then it reflects reality. And if it reflects reality, then Islamically it reflects the will of God. And therefore it's always a positive thing to learn such a thing, regardless of who figured it out. Alright, anything else to add?
Nope, let's call it a day.
Alright, well, thank you all for listening. If you have questions or comments, leave it in the comment sections if that's enabled, or shoot me an email, and that's that. See you next time.